Hello, everyone. Welcome to our latest Monday Majlis. Today we have Professor Tehseen Thaver from Princeton, who will be talking about her latest book. I'm going to, just as we normally do, the format that we have at the Majlis is that I'll ask her a few questions about her journey and about how it was that she came to write this book. And then she will give us a presentation on the book, after which there will be time for questions and answers. And at that point, you can either raise your hand to ask a question, or you can put the question in the chat, and we can take it up that way. Welcome, everyone. Welcome, Tehseen.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Sajjad, for inviting me and to the University of Exeter. It's a real privilege to come and talk about the book at this stage. So thank you to everyone for being here and taking out your precious time this Monday.
Thank you for agreeing to do this. And of course, I should also mention that I'm not going to say very much about this, or even in the Q&A, because I've actually endorsed the book anyway. So you should have a sense of what my feelings about the book are. But let me really kind of start us off by asking you what we often do in this format is, Tehseen, first, if you could tell us a bit about your kind of intellectual journey, how it was that you came into the field, why you came into the field. So just a bit about yourself and how you've got to where you are.
Sure. So I grew up and I was born and raised in Karachi, and I would say that I grew up in a family of critical thinkers, but no academics. Most of my colleagues would usually enter the fields of education or business or the arts, and that was what I expected myself to do. I went to LUMS, which is Lahore University of Management Sciences, for about a year and a half for my bachelor's. And in that time, they only had two majors that they offered, either economics or computer science. And even though I didn't think I was a humanities person at that time, I knew it wasn't either of those subjects. So I transferred to McGill and I did my undergrad at McGill. And I'm embarrassed to say that I never ever took a course on religion. I never entered the building of religion or Islamic studies. I never checked out a book on Islamic studies, even though I think I worked at the library there. So that's how far away I was from the field. I basically did an undergraduate in marketing and finance. And I came back to Pakistan, worked for about 5 years as a marketing manager, as well as in the textile industry. And this involved all kinds of travels and a different kind of life, I suppose. And then there was a switch to the humanities. And I think whenever I get asked the question of what caused the switch, what was the catalyst, it's a little bit of an anticlimactic answer, which is that I just started reading. And I think it's a reminder that life is full of contingencies, because I would visit these small local grocery stores in Karachi, and they would often carry books. It's like a CVS carrying books. And they had a lot of publications from the Sohail Academy, which is based in Lahore. So there's a lot of books on Sufism. They had stuff on, I remember one of the earliest books I read was by Majid Fakhri on Islamic theology. And I was completely fascinated by a topic that by this time I was in my 20s, but I had never, ever been exposed to any aspect of this tradition in my entire upbringing in Karachi. So I really felt that I had been gypped to a certain extent, and I felt that I needed to make up for it. So I thought about doing a master's and kind of primed my application in a way so that someone would accept me. And I took up a job at a local educational organization in which we would try to write up a Cambridge textbook for Islamic studies the course. I started taking Arabic classes with a bunch of older ladies in someone's living room, and so on. And I'm very grateful to the University of Virginia for admitting me. And here, of course, I was working with Professor Aziz Achadina. And he was, of course, someone that was known to me as a preacher in our community. And I used to really enjoy his majalis because they had an academic angle to them as well. And, he never quite left the classroom, even in his majlis. So I did my master's with him, and I still, wasn't, although the PhD and the academia as a profession had been demystified to a certain extent by that point, I still wasn't quite persuaded by it. So I went to Syria and to Jordan, where I pursued the study of Arabic for about a year and a half. And then I began to miss the structure. And I began to realize that I needed more guidance and this kind of unstructured study on my own was not quite working. So I started applying for PhD programs, eventually finished at UNC Chapel Hill under Carl Ernst and Ibrahim Musa at Duke, and of course Bruce Lawrence and Umeed, and they had this really fantastic program of Islamic studies in that research triangle, basically, which was very formative in the kind of book that I've even written. I think that goes entirely the sort of angle and the weight and the emphasis of a Shi'i exegesis in the study of religion that is trying to put it in conversation with larger questions in the humanities really goes back to a formative training that I received at UNC, where that was the objective of all subfields and tracks. And so it was a very interdisciplinary program. And yeah, so it's funny to talk about your narrative without it becoming an acknowledgments page or feeling like you need to make it an acknowledgments page, because there are so many people along the way that have made this possible. So I'm presenting this as if it was all these independent decisions and they kind of brought me here, but of course that's not exactly how it worked out. So I taught for a while at Lehigh University for a year as a Mellon scholar, and then to Bard College. I went to Bard College for 4 years. That was my first tenure track job in a small liberal arts college. And I think that was again a very formative moment, because while I was at McGill and Lum's, I had no clue actually what the difference was between a liberal arts education and a large kind of research university education. And my entire educational experience had been quite unguided. No, we didn't have any advisors. There was no such thing. Today, when I advise undergraduates on a daily basis, I find it shocking that they would leave us to ourselves in the way that they did. But so I think that teaching in an undergraduate liberal arts college became very close to my heart. The very philosophy of a liberal arts curriculum and the pedagogy was really something that I think was nourished during my time at Bard. And then, of course, after about 4 years, I came to Princeton, and I've been here for about 6 years. And so that's the intellectual kind of trajectory. But in terms of what brought me to al-Sharif al-Radi and this particular book, it actually was a short piece that I did for the Oxford Bibliographies Online on Shi'i tafsir. And it was meant to simply be, a bibliography of key works with an annotated bibliography. That was the nature of the piece. And that's how I came across al-Radi, and that's how I was sort of engaged in this task of saying, okay, these are this is what counts as Shi'i tafsir. These are the authors that come under this category. And so it got me thinking about categories and how they're defined, how we establish them, and what happens when certain works don't seem to fit so neatly in those categories. So that was really the building blocks for this project. And yeah.
I mean, if I just ask you one further thing on that, because, and I think this will be of interest to people who are grad students in particular, because they often wonder about this. When you look at the book and say you look at your dissertation, which is the basis of the book, how do you see the journey from the dissertation to the book? I mean, what do you think was the real development from the dissertation? And I guess simple question is, what do you think distinguishes a book from a dissertation?
It's a very important question, and we deal with it all the time here with graduate students. And I think that the book, as much as it's based on the dissertation, it really is, it kind of goes through its own life, and we underestimate that journey between the dissertation and the book. I think we just assume that we'll make a few changes and then that'll be it. But it actually has its own life, and that has a lot to do with your reviewers. I think that if you're lucky and you get, or if you're unlucky, and I think hopefully that can still push you in some good directions. But the review process is a really, really important part of the transformation that the dissertation undergoes and the polishing that the dissertation undergoes. And I think that was very, very important for this book. I must thank my anonymous reviewers for that. And there are a lot of things that um, a lot of decisions that you make in terms of how you want a particular specialized topic to be part of a very specific conversation. In which field do you want, where does the weight of this contribution lie? I think those kinds of decisions get made at the time of the book, at the time of choosing a publisher, at the time of choosing, what kind of readership you want, for where do you want to publish. So there are different kinds of publishers which publish different kinds of books, and the editor will also play a role in the final product of what you write. So I think, being attentive, I think a message to graduate students would be to be attentive to different publishers and the kinds of works that attract you, that resonate with you, that are good models for you, and to keep that in mind as future places that you might want to publish with. I think editors are very important. So, very good advice that was given to me is, think about what kind of person you would want to be reading your book. And that's the kind of place, that's the kind of editor you want. And at that point, you do have to be open to revising key aspects of it, and really pitching them in different directions, and shifting the emphasis so that it can reach wider audiences, and putting it in conversation beyond the specificity of this very rigorous, labor that you've put in with your own texts and your own actors. It's the kind of really important time to zoom out.
Well, yeah, no, I think that's very important, and thank you for that. I think we should move on to your presentation now, so
That's
that we
all.
can learn a bit more about the book, and then of course we'll take some questions after that. So please do go ahead and start.
Okay. So I have a talk of about 30 minutes, and before I get to it, I think it would be helpful for the audience if I just describe the book itself and the main argument, and the intervention that I'm trying to make through it in the study of both Islam and religion. So broadly speaking, my research focuses on exegetical traditions of the Quran. I primarily focus on pre-modern authors, but and authors that for different reasons have privileged a literary approach to engaging the Quran. Let me share my screen, sorry. Okay. Yeah.
Participants can now see your application. You have started screen share.
And sorry. Is that fine? You can still see the screen?
Yeah.
Okay. So this book is based on the study of an Arabic Qur'an commentary authored by a 10th century theologian, poet, and historian from the Twelver Shi'i school of thought, al-Sharif al-Radi, who died, of course, in 1015. So Radi lived in Baghdad, and which at this point was ruled by the Persian Buyid dynasty. And he's remembered as a towering exegete, poet, Arab linguist, and grammarian. He's actually most well known for his compilation of Ali ibn Abi Talib's discourses, the Nahj al-Balagha. But his Quran commentary, which is the topic of my book, focuses on the Quran's ambiguous verses or mutashabihat. And it's primarily centered on the verses in chapter 3, Surah Al Imran, because that's the only volume that has survived. And of course, the category of ambiguous verses around which Radi frames his discussion is a Quranic term, and it's derived from the iconic verse 7 of chapter 3. And the verse reads as follows. Yeah, it is he who has sent the scripture down to you. Some of its verses are definite in meaning. These are the cornerstone of the scripture, and others are ambiguous. So this verse entails a self-description of the Quran as a composition of two kinds of verses, conclusive and ambiguous. But the actual task of determining which of the Quran's verses fall under which category of clear or ambiguous was actually left to the individual interpreter. I argue that much of Radi's Quran commentary was invested not just in trying to resolve the ambiguous verses, but perhaps even more importantly, he was interested, and the heart of his project is about the effort to try and explain and justify the very purpose of ambiguity in a revealed text that by its nature is supposed to be clear and accessible. So there are three main points that I try to make throughout this book, and I also want to illustrate those with some examples. So we'll take a deep dive into the text of al-Radi with specific examples. But first, let me talk about the three main points that I want to make. Sorry, I'm just having some switching issues here. So the title of the book, Beyond Sectarianism. It refers to a critique that I've tried to offer throughout the book of a tendency in current scholarship to assume certain signature and predictable features of Quran commentaries authored by scholars who identified as Shia. So, for example, this includes features such as a focus on the Quran's esoteric meanings, or the legitimation and justification of the Shi'i position on the Imamat, or a necessarily confrontational and polemical attitude towards Sunni tradition and its scholars. Through the example of Radi, what I've tried to argue is that such an assumption of this neat correspondence between one's sectarian identity and their exegetical projects and purposes actually hides and forecloses discussion on a number of tremendously important and interesting questions and issues that are left out. And a clarification that I offer throughout the book.
Amir Emami has entered the waiting room. Press Command plus tilde to open pop-up or go to the participants panel to admit participant. Press CMD plus U to manage the waiting room. Amir Emami has left the meeting. Amir Emami has joined the meeting.
I hope Amir comes back.
Yeah,
but
I don't know why it's announcing all those things, but anyway.
okay, I don't either. So sorry, I can't help you there. But we'll transition it in. So okay, a clarification that
David Essett has entered the waiting room.
So
Press
Jab,
Command plus tilde to open pop-up or go to the participants panel to admit participant. Press
Maybe it's
CMD
me.
plus U to manage the
I don't
waiting
know.
room.
It doesn't normally ever announce things on, so I'm not sure what's going on. If
Can
it's
I maybe help out? I work in tech. You've got you got a MacBook.
Yeah.
I think you've got the accessibility thing, which is for people with sight issues. You've turned it
Exactly.
on.
Exactly. You should unlock this accessibility.
Ah.
I'll really quickly have a quick Google and put it up on the chat.
So am I doing that, Sajjad, or are you doing
yeah.
that?
I don't, because I think it's from your end. It's not from my end. Yeah, I think it's on your laptop.
So where would
Because
the
I don't have that set up at all, so normally it doesn't say anything.
so where would the accessibility
Go to the Apple menu on the far left, the little Apple icon, and click on it.
Yeah.
And then you click on system settings, right? And then you'll see accessibility under general.
I don't have accessibility. Okay, yes, yes.
Okay, and then voiceover, it's either you or it might be the person hosting the call, but it's someone.
I switched it off. It was open. Sorry.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you very much, Imtiaz. That was very helpful. Okay, where was I? Yeah, so a key clarification that I offer throughout the book and that I should make from the get-go here is that by actually calling for what I describe as a non-sectarian approach to the study of the Quran, I don't intend to undermine, of course, the centrality of the Shi'i tradition to al-Radi's religious and intellectual identity. Rather, my main point is that by approaching a scholar like al-Radi exclusively through the lens of his sectarian identity, we're not actually able to view, examine, or highlight some of the other major intellectual questions, traditions, and processes that his Quran commentary was involved in, to which it responded, and to which it contributed. This brings me to the second main point of the book, which is that in moving away from a sectarian-driven approach, I argue and I try to show that one of the main contributions of Radi's Quran commentary was to the project of the canonization of the Arabic language. By focusing on the Quran's ambiguous verses, Radi sought to articulate and give shape to an emerging canon of the Arabic language that was constituted by three sources: the Quran, pre-Islamic and early Islamic Arabic poetry, and the everyday speech of Arabs. Moreover, as a part of his Quran commentary, he proposed and he tried to theorize, solidify a theory of language whereby language represented a reflection of ontological reality. Finally, this theory of language was suffused with a very particular charged aesthetic register, such as that of wonder, through which al-Radi not only did he try to exhibit his linguistic muscle and excellence through this register, but more importantly, he made an argument for the canon and canonicity of Arabic and the priority of language over logic, which was a debate at its peak during his life. So, in a nutshell, through very close readings of various moments in Radi's commentary, I argue for viewing Quran commentaries beyond a sectarian lens in a way that might highlight other significant intellectual currents, such as the theorization, canonization of language that his commentary was involved and implicated in. And in addition to offering close readings of the text, I also try to situate Radi's commentary and its major questions and contributions in the intellectual and political context of 10th century Buyid, Baghdad. So before I get to examples from the text, I'll just add a few staging comments by saying a bit more about Radi's commentary itself. So this is in contrast to a verse-by-verse commentary, which was the custom for exegetes of this period. Radi selects for analysis only those verses, as I mentioned, that result in ambiguities. And the chapters of the exegesis are dedicated to answering a broader question regarding an ambiguity or set of ambiguities that a particular verse could raise. And he answers these questions according to the question and answer style that was common to theological argumentation during this period. So the question and answer format is premised on the disputational style of, if they were to say, then I would say. And the beginning of every chapter in his commentary basically follows this scheme of staging and then engaging the question of a hypothetical interlocutor. So I've put on the slide here just a few examples of the kinds of questions some of the verses would raise. And, just we'll go over some specific examples, but verse 326, can God give power to the unjust? Verse 314, can God be a beautifier of desires, implicitly negative desires, and so on. And but the larger question that I want to address in this talk as well is, how did al-Radi understand the idea of ambiguity in language and in the Quran? Al-Radi's understanding of ambiguity is, and by extension, how one ought to define the Quran's ambiguous verses, was actually tied to an underlying question about the very role and place of ambiguity in a text like the Quran. How did the presence of ambiguity in the Quran sit together with its inimitability, for example? If the Quran is, as it presents itself, an inimitable text in its clarity and its sophistication of language, then how can it also be ambiguous? Or what is this meaning of ambiguous as it's being employed by Radi here? So for Radi, the presence of ambiguity in the Quran was neither coincidental nor a superfluous detraction. Exactly to the contrary, for Radi, ambiguity in the Quran was the primary linguistic tool through which the Quran generated and communicated awe-inspiring meanings. Far from viewing ambiguity as something to be endured, overcome, or even tranquilized through the rationalizing efforts of exegetes, al-Radi makes a case for the benefit of the strenuous intellectual labor that ambiguities demand from their readers, as well as for the epistemological gains that come from such an exercise. Ambiguities demand efforts from readers because they require that one move from a state of unknowing, where a meaning remains open, unsettled, or even misunderstood, to that of knowing, marked by an ambiguity's settlement and correct understanding. Or in Radi's words, it entails the movement from a mutashabih, ambiguous verse, to its corresponding and clarifying muhkam, or clear verse. Radi sees the steps for this semiotic movement between ambiguity and clarity as something that was built into every ambiguous phrase or word. And in this movement from ambiguity to clarity, a key role was played by the exegete's ability to evoke awe and wonder for the reader, an ability which, in the context of 10th century Buyid Baghdad, in which al-Radi was writing, was increasingly seen as the litmus test for establishing one's eloquence and linguistic excellence. Moreover, and this is a crucial point, the capacity for someone to master language at this time also signaled the capacity to manage and control the affairs of society, because ultimately language was but a reflection of ontological and social reality. So in the context in which Radi was writing, it wasn't far-fetched for a claimant of rhetorical ability to also make a claim to political power. Similarly, in the Haqaiq, al-Radi's display and affirmation of linguistic mastery over the mysteries and ambiguities of the Quran was actually integral to his claim over the political office of no less than the caliphate. In a particular instance, important instance in his diwan, he is unequivocally critical of the Abbasids and proclaims the superiority of his lineage over theirs. Return the inheritance of Muhammad. Return it. For neither the staff nor the Prophet's mantle are yours. Does blood like Fatima's flow in your veins, or do you have a grandfather like Muhammad? In the final lines of another qasida, which are Radi dedicated to the Abbasid Caliph al-Qadir, he boldly declares, "When men compete in glory, there's no difference between us at all. Each of us is of the noblest origins. Except for the caliphate, I am deprived of it while you are crowned." By authoring a commentary focused on the Quran's ambiguous verses, he presents his own position as a descendant of the Prophet, a Sayyid, and a leader of the Shi'i community as a testament to his linguistic and political authority. He saw his sacred lineage as intimately connected to his knowledge of a pure Arabic language. For him, language and lineage were mutually entwined. So, with these background notes in place, let's dive into Radi's Quran commentary itself for some case studies or illustrations of these very points and arguments. So, as an illustrative example, I turn to his discussion of the ambiguous verse, which reads, I'll read it in English and then the key phrase in Arabic as well. "The disbelievers should not think that it is better for them that we give them respite. We give them respite so that they become more sinful. A shameful torment awaits them." And in the Arabic, of course, the phrase is, "Innama numli lahum liyazdadu ithman." No longer notice. So the dilemma that's posed by Radi's hypothetical interlocutor is that, according to an apparent reading of this verse, the presence of the term "so that" or li suggests the seemingly absurd conclusion that God actually desires sinfulness from the disbelievers. The term "so that" seems to posit here a causal correlation between God's granting respite to the disbelievers and them increasing in sin. So how can this be true? Radi responds to his interlocutor's puzzlement by articulating the principle that the first step and order of business while interpreting such an ambiguous verse was to refer it back to a clear verse. And the purpose of this kind of referral was to find instances of clear verses in which the ambiguous parts of the ambiguous verse, such as the construction "so that" in verse 3178, is not employed with any ambiguity. So in his view, for a verse to count as clear or apparent or muhkam, its structural soundness must be coupled with the balanced and rational logic of its message. These qualities invest muhkam verses with a power of referential authority, in the sense that an exegete can then refer to it as a model statement that fulfills the criteria necessary for the apparent sense to count as the intended meaning. So, for instance, as a first step in his attempt to clarify the ambiguity raised in 3178 regarding the illogical use of the construction li, "so that," he mobilizes another verse in which this construction was operative along similar modalities. وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونِ. I did not create jinn and mankind except so that they worship me. According to Radi, this verse clearly counts as a muhkam verse, which is compatible with rational proof, since the letter lam in liya'buduni occurs in a way which reflects its intended meaning. So how is this verse connected to the previous verse? Because it represents a parallel model of a muhkam verse that shares the ambiguous construction of 3178, the term "so that," without being crippled with any ambiguity. So once this was identified, Radi is now in a position to argue for an alternate grammatical meaning of the ambiguous word or sentence in question. For example, he turns, in this case, to non-Quranic sources to argue that even though lam in the language of the Arabs can carry the meaning of "in order to," it can also carry the meaning of recompense. For this task, he draws on his background as a renowned poet of his time by highlighting another meaning of the preposition li from the poetic lexicon. He proposed that his readers observe the following poem that also seem to articulate contradictory uses of the preposition li. We gather our wealth so that it can be passed on as inheritance. We build our houses so that they decay with time. For imminent death does every wet nurse raise the child. For ultimate destruction do humans build civilizations anew. Al-Radi showed that the causal meaning of li in these verses is not rationally sound. Since human beings raise children for life, not for death, they build houses to last, not to decay, and they collect wealth to benefit from it for themselves, not to transfer it to someone else. But when this is the ultimate fate of these actions, then it's more eloquent for the poet to use li in the way that he does, Al-Radi contended. So in light of the use of li in this poem, when one turns to the verse, we give them respite so that they become more sinful, it becomes obvious that the relationship between the provision of respite and the condition of becoming sinful is not causal, but it's rather resultative, or the outcome of the respite of life. So what I've shown in this discussion is that for Radi, the main hermeneutical key to resolving a Quranic ambiguity lies in exploring the varied traditions of the Arabic language, including verses of the Qur'an, other Arabic poetry. And this allowed Radi to achieve various discursive and political goals in one stroke. First, he valorizes the Arabic language as the fundamental source of knowledge. Two, he demonstrates the normative productivity of ambiguity as a hermeneutical principle. And three, he dramatizes his own authority as an exegete and poet whose intellectual persona was first and foremost defined as an expert of the Arabic language. But still, another question looms large. How could a revealed text that announces itself as clear and conclusive be riddled with ambiguities? And this question is really at the heart of the relationship between language and theology, and it haunts al-Radi's exegesis as well. Indeed, much of his Quran commentary is invested not just in trying to resolve the puzzle of the ambiguities themselves, but more importantly, is the attempt to justify and explain the very purpose and presence of ambiguity, as I said at the start of this talk. So critical to addressing this question is to observe that Radi's project on the ambiguous verses is not just directed at removing doubt or confusion about the meaning of these verses. Much more than that, by positioning the ambiguous verses at the heart of his hermeneutical enterprise, he actually valorizes these verses as the primary repositories of the most subtle secrets of the Quran that are only accessible through the very equally subtle mysteries of language. And this is how ambiguity works as a normative hermeneutical principle in his exegetical project and imaginary. So let me actually turn to a specific example that again illustrates what I'm trying to say here, which is about this Radi's conception of the very purpose of ambiguity, beyond the task of and mandate of resolving ambiguities. So verse 391 clarifies this conundrum, and it reads, "Those who disbelieve and die disbelievers will not be saved, even if they offer enough gold to fill the entire earth. Agonizing torment is in store for them, and there will be no one to help them." And the key phrase here is, "Walau iftada bihi." Walau iftada. So here, al-Radi's interlocutor expresses his puzzlement by the seeming redundancy of the Arabic letter waw between the two clauses of this verse. This is because the term law, for him, sufficiently communicates the meaning of even if. So what's the need for this additional waw? Now, Arabic grammar admitted a category known as the extra or superfluous letters, al-huruf al-mazida, which was a critical tool for poets of Arabic to achieve rhythmic harmony in the composition of their verses. And many Quran commentators had held that these kinds of moments in the Quran could represent examples of superfluous letters, as in the same way that they appear in Arabic poetry. But al-Radi's interlocutor probed him about the usefulness of such a category of excess language. And al-Radi, in his response, disagreed with the application of such a category in relation to Quranic verses. In so doing, he advances an important principle of eloquent speech. And that principle was this: since the Quran constituted a text of purposeful guidance from God, it could not contain any superfluity. So then, in that case, what explains the presence of the seemingly superfluous wow? Radi seeks to resolve this conundrum by arguing that the presence of the wow represents a linguistic trace for that part of the verse's meaning that was left unsaid. So in 391, he argues that the purpose of the wow there is to clarify the general attempt to God at the time of one's death as an unbeliever will not be accepted by God. The general attempt to turn to God will not be accepted, which is to say, let me maybe bring back that verse. This is hard to follow, which is to say that the presence of the wow, Radi argued, generalizes God's refusal beyond the specific instance of a group for offering enough gold to fill the earth as ransom. So it's not just this particular group whose prayer would not be accepted, but rather that in the general meaning. So the wow here is not just a superfluous prosthetic that's not adding to the meaning of the verse. Exactly to the contrary, it's actually the wow that lends meaning to what comes after it, making visible a form of meaning that would otherwise be absent from the apparent text of the verse. So the wow, or the so-called ambiguity of the verse, emerges as both the carrier as well as the adjudicator of meaning in the Quran. Put differently, the seeming prosthetic of the wow indexes the significance of ambiguity as an epistemic register intimately interwoven into the Quran's texture and interpretive fabric. And as always, he turns to examples from the Quran to support this reading. And I won't perhaps get into those specific supporting examples that he presents. And I'll just turn to the next and final example that I want to turn to further elaborate Radi's engagement with the Quran's ambiguous verses, which really hones in on this question of what exactly is the purpose of ambiguity. And the verse reads, this is verse 336, and it reads, "But when she gave birth, she said, 'My Lord, I have given birth to a girl.' God knew best what she had given birth to. The male is not like the female. I name her Mary, and I commend her and her offspring to your protection from the rejected Satan." So the key phrase here is وَلَيْسَ الذَّكَرُ كَالْأُنْثَى, which is the male is not like the female. This verse raises pressing theological questions. For instance, how, asks the hypothetical interlocutor, can the verse state the male is not like the female? He argues that this seems to have no instructional purpose and only states the obvious. So the ambiguity that emerges is, how can any part of the Quran be redundant, since this would raise doubt about the Quran's rhetorical value? So Radi's discussion is framed as a response to this charge that the revelatory text could be redundant. But during the course of his explanation, he draws on his understanding of language and its relationship to the realities that it represents. He asserts that the name of a thing in the language of the Arabs can represent that which the thing aspires toward and desires to become. So to paraphrase, al-Radi posits that language not only reflects fixed essences or substances, it can also convey the process of becoming. For Radi, this aspect is one of the subtle mysteries of language that's available only to the exclusive few that are endowed with the ability to traverse its multiple layers of meaning. With this context in place, Radi described the specific kind of male-female difference that's being emphasized in this verse, and he explains why this kind of difference would exist. He says that the male is not like the female does not refer to a difference in essential traits. That would be to state the obvious. Instead, he points to varied social conditions that existed for males and females, including restrictions on women to serve in the Holy Temple because of questions of menstruation, childbirth, etc. He ties this restriction to broader generalization of women's failure to effectively fulfill social contracts. He argues that women are intellectually weaker, more feeble than men in this regard. And he connects this supposed inadequacy on their part to the legal stipulation that their word is not counted as equal in weight to that of men in the affair of giving testimonies. Most crucially, after establishing this variance between the sexes in the realm of social affairs, he seeks to establish a correspondence between what he viewed as ontological realities and their linguistic equivalents. And it's here that we find most clearly this interplay between language and ontology that's at work in his hermeneutic. So he notes that Abul Hasan al-Akhfash, who died in 835, who's the student and transmitter of the famous grammarian Sibawayh's teachings, stated that Arabs, when they were referring to women, would say shahidi, or this is a witness, in the masculine construction of the term witness, even though they meant a woman. Now, in which case, what they should have been saying is shahidati, but instead they say shahidi, so it's a masculine construction. So the crucial point that Radi tries to raise through this is that the use of this male label for a female unveils a secret of the Arabic language. And that secret is that Arabs sought to complete the deficiency in the woman's meaning by attaching a male descriptor to her. And so the similarity drawn between her and him in this verse for Radi was akin to how the Arabs might name a person who was stung, ladigh, as healthy, salim, or refer to the person who was destroyed as victorious. Now, Quran and gender studies scholar Ash Gasinger has pointed out that late medieval Muslim writings were informed by a Galenic notion of viewing free, able-bodied males as the most complete examples of what it meant to be human. And female bodies in this instance were considered to be deviations from that norm. Moreover, male and female bodies were thought to differ in degree rather than in kind. And we see that Radi's discussion corresponds to this understanding of gender that's described by contemporary historians as the one-sex body. And most notably, he goes on to show how this reality was actually reflected in the Arabic language. So Radi, what we see here is that Radi is no different from his medieval contemporaries in his less than egalitarian views on male-female relations. But the critical point that I want to underscore is that Radi imagined the rules of language as a repository for subtle social realities. He regarded the subtle references of language to have been perfected in the revelatory text, which for him demonstrated this harmonious relationship between grammatical literality and ontological reality. Each element of language, from conjunctions, prepositions, particles, and other grammatical operations, was imbued with ontologically manifested meaning. And underlying Radi's appreciation for these epistemological connections was the idea that language ultimately mirrored both ontological realities as well as social realities. So ambiguity in language opened the door to the many wonders that it contained. And the literary mastery and guidance of teachers like Radi was, of course, essential for enabling access to these wonders. So to close, let me make 2 points, take-home points from this talk. First, at the heart of Radi's commentary was this mission of articulating and establishing his religious authority as a guardian of pure Arabic language. And we hear this commanding voice of a Radi in the Haqaiq, which points to riddle after riddle in the Quranic text, only to masterfully resolve them one by one. And I argue that it points to his view that the language of the Quran had to be accessible through the rules of language, which were ultimately established by human convention. And it's language that shaped the parameters of the kinds of liberties that one could take while exercising one's exegetical will. But by deriving the meaning of the Quran's ambiguities from a fixed literary canon, Radi argued for an unshakable linguistic ontology. In this way, what I mean is that although his literary approach to the Quran argued for a linguistically transgressive interpretation of certain verses, the very clearly defined sources for his interpretation did achieve a rhetorical lockdown on the text's possibilities, hermeneutical possibilities. Of course, lest this give the impression that Radi's operation was, when I speak of rhetorical lockdowns, unless I give the sense that his operation was devoid of any aesthetic value, let me clarify that even though a Radi sought to argue for fixed linguistic truths, he was equally invested in the exercise of evoking wonder and delight in his reader. By masterfully guiding the reader into the complex world of language, he sought to make visible the subtle inner workings and secrets that language harbors about human beings and the worlds that they inhabit. The second key takeaway point that I want to end with is to actually reinforce the stakes of a larger methodological point about the study of Shiism that I've tried to make today. In the Western Academy, a major problem exists whereby the study of Shiism is often minoritized by the very sorts of questions that one raises about the Shi'i tradition that have to do with what are assumed to be its characteristically Shi'i themes and topics. So what I've tried to show today is that the main problem with this kind of approach is that it, by its nature, naturalizes the minoritization of Shi'ism on the one hand, and forecloses any discussion on how a specific topic might be connected to a much wider intellectual traditions, questions, currents. So, of course, while this book and this talk have focused on one genre, that of Quran exegesis, the conceptual commitment to disentangle religious thought and sectarian identity can really productively be applied to a number of other intellectual fields, I hope. And so, again, I want to repeat and clarify, I am not trying to say that sectarian identity is unimportant to any intellectual work of Muslim scholars, or that it bears no consequence to their thought, be that in any field of knowledge. But rather, I would say my plea is that when sectarian identity, especially in a case of a minoritized identity such as Twelver Shi'i, is privileged as the primary determiner of a scholar like Sharif al-Radi's exegetical writings and his religious imaginary, such a move invariably thwarts the possibility of a number of potentially productive other pathways of analysis and inquiry. And I think I'll stop here and take questions. Thank you so much for your patience with this rather dense talk.
Thank you, Tehseen. I'm going to stop recording now.